Everybody has heard of the Federal Reserve, but nobody really knows very much about what the Federal Reserve really is and how it's constituted and how it works or doesn't work. So we're very quickly going to consider several perspectives on the Federal Reserve together. I call these the Federal Reserve as philosopher king, Federal Reserve as fire department, the Federal Reserve as arsonist, the Federal Reserve as constitutional problem, the Federal Reserve as 12 banks, and finally, the Federal Reserve as the Wizard of Oz. Well, the Federal Reserve as philosopher king. Federal Reserve Act was passed in December of 1913, and at the time there were many predictions about how having this new Federal Reserve created will mean that we'll never again have a financial crisis. There won't ever again be any more banking panics. There'll be no runs. There'll be no financial collapses. Well, of course, all these predictions were completely wrong because they assumed that the Federal Reserve would know enough about the financial future to be able to prevent the problems, and that was wrong. Moreover, it didn't consider that the Federal Reserve might itself be active in creating the problems, as it does. One of the problems most relevant to you all at your age is the current extremely high price of houses. The high price of houses were importantly stoked and increased and inflated by the Federal Reserve's policy to suppress artificially mortgage rates to historically low and abnormal levels, all during the 2010s, and thereby to put house prices up. When you push down the rates, you push up the prices. And the unaffordable prices are in some important measure a result of the overachievement of the Fed on its attempts and on its successful attempts to manipulate the mortgage rates down to very low. Now, to be a philosopher king. This is the idea that somehow these guys in the Federal Reserve, we can create a committee, mostly composed of economists, and this committee will meet in Washington and they'll figure out what has to be done to so-called manage the economy or manage the financial system. The theory of a philosopher king, I hope you do read Plato's Republic here. Know that to be a philosopher king, you have to have superior knowledge. You have to be smarter and more informed and know more than everybody else. Well, unfortunately, that knowledge is not available. I mentioned again Hayek. Von Mises and Hayek developed the problem of knowledge, which makes state management, successful state management of economies impossible, requires markets, and the Fed is a good example of that. There is no way that the Fed can have the knowledge to manage the economy, to manage the financial system, because no one can know what the financial and economic condition will be. Now, when we went through the David Gordon library a minute ago, my wife, who is happily here with me, pointed out one of his books, which is now here in the collection, and it was Journeying in Darkness. I thought, this is perfect for my talk on the Fed. The Fed is up there journeying in darkness. Well, actually isn't quite darkness. It's really fog. It's not dark, but it's gray, and things are wrapped in fog. And actually, Chairman Powell captured this very well himself in a talk recently. One of the important concepts in economics is the natural rate of interest. Anybody know how you write in the natural rate of interest? It's small r asterisk. And in economic formulas, small r asterisk, and then you pronounce it r starred. The natural rate of interest has a certain problem. It can never be observed. It's a purely theoretical idea, a fine idea, but it's purely theoretical. And in talking about this, Powell brilliantly said, in my opinion, we're trying to navigate by the stars on a cloudy night. Navigate by the stars we can't see. Very true. Well, that's a fundamental problem the Fed has. All right, I turn to the Fed as fire department. One of the first line of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 reads, to create Federal Reserve banks, to establish Federal Reserve banks to provide an elastic currency. An elastic currency. That's why they were doing the Federal Reserve banks, the first and most important reason. Well, what does an elastic currency mean? It's a little old-fashioned, but it means that when you get in trouble, you can rush in and print up some more money and finance the crisis. This actually is okay as a crisis idea. But when the crisis is over, you have to stop and go back to normal. And the problem is that they never know when to stop. Just like they were still manipulating mortgage rates until 2022, which was 14 years after the housing collapse of 2008 when they justified doing that. So that's the Fed as fire department. So when there's a fire, the Fed rushes in as fire department and puts out the monetary fire by throwing on some more paper. But they need to stop when the fire is over. Well, James Grant has amusingly said, and it's quoted in the Mises movie on the Federal Reserve, if you've ever seen it, the Fed is the world's leading financial fire department, but also the leading arsonist, the leading financial arsonist. So they're both arsonist and fire department. And among the fires they rush in to put out are the fires they started themselves. So what does that mean? That means the Fed is the source of inflation. And the inflationary, they're always talking about fighting inflation. Well, they're fighting the inflation that they created themselves. So therefore, arsonist as well as fire department. I want to just share a little bit of math. The Fed has announced, as you know, a 2% inflation target. Interestingly, announced as the Fed's target, not the country's target. Good heavens. How'd that happen? It is, they've been listening, and they have, I'm sorry, and they're checking on me. So let's do a little math. Lifetime these days is about 80 years. Life expectancy, 80 years. So what happens if you have 2% inflation for a lifetime? What have prices done? Well, they've quintupled. Nearly, if not quite 5 times. And what has happened to the purchasing power of $1 in one lifetime at 2%? It's gone down to 20 cents. That's a 2%. Now, recently, they've talked about 3%. I mean, inflation is 3%. Well, does 3% sound like a lot more than 2%? Well, maybe not. I mean, it's only 1%. In an 80-year lifetime, at 3%, the prices rise more than 10 times. This is just compound interest math, but you know, it always amazes us, the power of compound interest. At a 3% inflation, the prices will be 10 times at the end of your life as they were when you arrived on the scene, and the purchasing value of the dollar will be 9 cents instead of $1. I mean, this is astonishing math. Well, how about 4%? Do you really want to know? It's 23 times. So things that sound, when you're talking about as percent rates of growth, as maybe small, and in inflation, turn into very large depreciation of the currency. And therefore, as money intertwines in our life, the depreciation of your wages, of your savings, and in general, the creation, exactly as von Mises or Hayek would say, of maladjustments and mistakes in finance and economic. Now, I mentioned in 1971 when President Nixon announced the closing of the gold redemption of the dollar, he said he had instructed the Secretary of the Treasury temporarily to stop redeeming dollars for gold. Well, we know what the temporarily is. The temporarily is at least until now. So it's 54 years so far. Now, that might lead us to the question of the Fed as a constitutional problem. Who, under the Constitution of the United States, what part of the government is assigned the power to manage the money of the country? It's the Congress. It's a sole power and duty. Well, what the Constitution says is to coin money. We don't do so much of that anymore. Parenthetically, you know that American coins, which used to have silver in them, if you dropped them on a table, they rang. They were sound money. They had a. Now, what happens when you drop our coins on a table? They go clunk. Well, inflation, in my opinion, goes clunk in general. All right, so here's the constitutional problem. The Congress has the sole power of money to coin money and to regulate its value. Regulating the value of money means either preserving its purchasing power or depreciating it, as we were just talking about. Congress also has another sole power, taxation. Why is this relevant? Because inflation is taxation. Inflation is a way of taking the people's purchasing power and giving it to the government without having to bother passing any tax legislation. This is one reason why central banks are so handy to governments. The world is, every government now wants a central bank. Why? Because they're so useful for taxing without having to legislate taxes. And that's coming back to what I said in the beginning, one of the important reasons why the central banks, including the Fed, are such a prop to the power of the government of our country and of all countries. All right, let's, so how do you manage, the end of the constitutional problem is who is the Fed's boss? To whom is the Fed accountable? The Fed likes to claim it's independent. That's nonsense. No part of a government gets to be a power on its own, at least not in a constitutional republic, and certainly not in our constitutional republic. The answer is it should be responsible to the Congress, and we have a lot of work to do on that. Not, by the way, to the president, to the Congress. All right, think of the Federal Reserve as banks. The Federal Reserve System has a board of governors, and it has 12 Federal Reserve banks. Well, each of these banks is a bank. It has loans, it has deposits, it has investments, it has capital, or it had capital, past tense. It's a bank, has income, expense, and it is important, and hardly anybody does it. I remember a talk I had some years ago with a very prominent economist, very smart guy, and I said to him, well, if you look at the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, he said, what do you mean? I said, well, you know, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. He said, do they have one? I said, well, yes. If you look at the Federal Reserve's financial statements, which I do as a financial type, you discover that in the last 3 years, they have lost vast amounts of money. They're created to make money for the government. The Federal Reserve is structured to make money for the government from the government's monopoly of currency, which it gives to the Federal Reserve. But in fact, they've lost. Now, does anybody happen to know how much, Howard, not you, because we talked about this at lunch, how much they lost in the last 3 years? Well, the answer is an interesting number, more than $240 billion with a B dollars. This should be impossible, but the Federal Reserve managed to do it. How much capital does the Federal Reserve have? Well, they had $46 billion in capital, but you know, if you've lost $240 billion and your capital was $46 billion, all right, this is a quiz, pop quiz. If your capital is 46 and you've lost 240, what's your capital now? Well, it's negative 194 billion. That's astonishing, actually, to think about it. And if you think about the Fed as banks, which they're also that, you see these things in their financial statements, and you may wish to study those. And if you'd like to read probably more than you really would like to read, you could read my papers on this topic. And finally, the Fed is Wizard of Oz. I don't know, is it Generation Z? Did you watch the Wizard of Oz movie when you were little? And you remember the wonderful scene in the end when they're finally confronted with the great Wizard of Oz and the little dog pulls the curtain back and it's revealed that it's all a fraud and the Wizard of Oz is just under there with his loudspeaker and his controls. And what does he say? Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. Well, the Federal Reserve is a magnificent, I gotta say, no one in the world, in my opinion, is better at public relations and political relations than the Federal Reserve System. They really work hard on it, and they're really great at it. And they're like the Wizard of Oz. They have this, and by the way, and they never admit they made a mistake. And so there's this kind of mythology that goes all together into the philosopher king and the grand manager of the economy, the all-wise guiding power of the economy. It's all like the Wizard of Oz. If you question it, they'll tell you, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. But in fact, here's my last advice, pay a lot of attention to the man behind the curtain. Try to see what's really going on. Come to the Federal Reserve, and indeed, all things institutional with plenty of skepticism and wanting to really understand what's going on. And with that, if you have questions, I think we have a couple minutes. I could take them. Yes?
With the Genius Act and the Pollock Act being signed, do you see the Fed's power being moved?
I do not. Well, Genius Act, as far as stable coins go, stable coins are part of the dollar system. If you own a stable coin, you have a different way of making a payment, but the payment is still dollars. You're part of the world dollar system presided over by the Federal Reserve. And if the Federal Reserve inflates away the value of the dollar or depreciates the dollar, your stable coin goes down in exactly the same amount. So no.
My question is, you mentioned in wartime, the possibility of monetary expansion could potentially be a good thing.
If you want to win the war, you've got to pay the soldiers.
Right. However, the problem is...
But better is not to have the war if you can avoid it.
Yeah. But the problem is, after wartime, the temptation to turn off the money is just too great. So what would be the alternative if we're not going to just get rid of the system? Because I don't think it's just going to be a case where Congress already gets overcome.
You're correct. That is not going to happen. And my own view is to reform the Fed in various ways. One of them is this. We have to distinguish, really, I want to come back to your point on prices. So historically what happened is that prices, that during the war, all governments, most governments, including the United States, through the Fed in both world wars, printed a lot of money, created very high inflation. Historically, let's say after the Civil War or after the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, the prices then came back down. They stopped the printing. So you can imagine a system in which on average prices move little, they go sideways, but in fact they go up and they go down. But one of the really interesting questions is, why do we think that it's bad for prices to go down? We have currently now a belief, which some of my friends call inflation phobia. In fact, Joe Salerno, the head of the intellectual work at Mises Institute, just gave a talk on this a couple weeks ago, saying, what's wrong with prices going down? Wouldn't you like to go to the grocery and have the prices go down? Well, sure you would. And in an inflationist world, the rate of inflation might go down. So ask yourself, when they say inflation goes down, what does that mean? It means prices are rising at a somewhat slower rate, but they're still rising. So you have to distinguish in your mind between our prices stable over time, which would mean sometimes they have to go down because sometimes they are going to go up. Well, then do they also go down, and they go back up and they go down, and maybe trace more or less a flat line over time? That would be a stable currency or a stable value of money. Or are we in an inflationist world where prices always go up, and the only question is, are they going up faster, or really a lot faster, or somewhat less fast, or somewhat slower, but always rising? So the rate of change versus the level of prices. And in the aftermath of COVID, I remember a plaintive article in the Wall Street Journal by one of the Fed sympathizing reporters saying, why don't people see that inflation is going down? To which my response was, because they see that prices are still going up. Inflation is down, but prices are up. So we got to keep those straight, and that's a fundamental issue in defining the nature of a monetary system. Okay, thank you all. Great to be here with you.